Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. We were chartered by Congress as a living memorial to former President Woodrow Wilson. And in addition to our annual cohort of scholars from around the world, the Wilson Center is made up of 14 thematic and regional institutes, and we cover issues across the globe. So, congressionally chartered and scholarship-driven, we are also fiercely nonpartisan. The Global Europe program focuses on the global challenges facing Europe and our transatlantic partnership. This week, the European Commission, which is the EU's de facto cabinet, took office for its new 5-year term. And as it begins its work, we wanted to examine the Commission's goals and strategies for the years ahead. What have they identified as priorities? Where will they direct their manpower and their money and their expertise for the next 5 years? And a key question for us, how will the Commission's strategy affect the relationship with the U.S.? How can the U.S. work productively with this new Commission? And because, of course, we also are changing and we will have a new administration in a very few weeks. So the last commission, which ran from 2019 to 2024, was also led by the same individual that heads this commission, Ursula von der Leyen. But what is remarkable is how the challenges have changed. In part, that's due to the work that the EU did for those 5 years. But it's also due to key events that changed strategic thinking in Europe. So remember, in 2019, the Commission was very focused on climate change, and it pushed for a European Green Deal and achieved it. The Commission was also focused on building and continuing economic strength, digitalization, furthering democracy, and building a stronger Europe in the world. As we look back on that, we can see these are priorities for a post-Brexit and pre-pandemic EU. In 2019, Britain was just months away from its official exit. The EU needed to restructure itself to account for this massive change. But I would argue that dealing with the consequences of Brexit was actually easier than dealing with the consequences of the pandemic. Because COVID-19 highlighted the supply chain dependencies for Europe, just as it did for us. And it also underscored differing national approaches to managing the illness, even as the EU used its collective muscle to acquire vaccines. The pandemic strained trade relationships and economies. Both the EU and its member states are still dealing with this reordered post-pandemic world. Of course, adding to that and to the uncertainty and the challenges was Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. War changed Europe's threat perception and brought issues like defense cooperation from the back burner, or maybe even the warming drawer, to the front burner, where they required constant attention to prevent boiling over. The EU's ability to deal with unexpected challenges, the global pandemic, the outbreak of war, demonstrated remarkable resilience. But given the shifts in geopolitical and the economic landscape, it is no surprise that the 2024 to 2029 Commission has new priorities and new tasks to perform. They will reshape some enduring goals and put new ones up front. Not surprisingly, competitiveness is at the top of the list, including a focus on energy. The Commission foresees an expansion of trade policy, even as it tries to ensure that vital technology is protected and de-risking, particularly from China, continues. Security and defense are also issues at the top of the Commission's priorities, with the creation of a new defense commissioner focused literally on getting more bang for the buck with the EU defense industry. The new Commission also sees Europe as global and wants to leverage its power and partnerships effectively. It raises the importance of lagging EU enlargement processes and establishes a new commissioner for the Mediterranean to prompt more effective engagement with this critical region. Our analysis both here today on the panel and in the publication that we are putting out today, looks at what this, not only at these priorities, but what it means for U.S. policymakers. Our event today brings together several of our scholars and contributors for a vibrant discussion of what these changes mean. In the end, I want to express our huge thanks to the Friedrich Naumann Foundation and give the floor to Mr. Martin Biesel, head of the North America Regional Office, because it's their support that made this event and the publication possible. Martin, over to you.
Well, thank you, Robin, and thank you, the Wilson Center. I think this is a great cooperation that we would like to continue, and it is a great day to present a paper on EU and the Commission, because you might have read it, there was a breakthrough in the Mercosur negotiations after 25 years. So I think this is really important, because some consider, and I know in the US this image is also widespread, some consider the EU an inefficient organization that is difficult to understand, and they prefer bilateral relations. So I think this EU-Mercosur deal is a proof of concept that the EU is really beneficial, even though I'm aware that there are minor things like national ratifications still be done, but I think it's a special day for the EU as a whole. Dear guests, thank you for introducing the paper from the US perspective. I would naturally take a more European perspective. The Friedrich Naumann Foundation here in Washington is a strictly partisan organization because we share, even though we're as an organization totally independent, but we share the values of the Free Democrats in Germany, like freedom and responsibility. But I'm not intend to go to German politics right now. And I would like to extend a great thank you to the authors of this paper. If you're like I did, I just flipped to the issue that interested me most, and I said, "Well, that's great." And from there on, I can back and forth, and it's kind of a menu that you don't have to read all 30 pages, but it's worthwhile to do it. Why did we initiate this cooperation with the Wilson Center? Of course, because of its brilliant reputation, but we also had some topics in mind. We want to send out the message that Europe is the most important economic and political partner for the US. And we want to make clear that Europe has to undergo, and already is undergoing, a program to increase its competitiveness. You mentioned it already. We want to send out the message that a stronger Europe is in the interest of the US. The Draghi report gives the new Commission and the whole EU, I think, the headline for this new term, and it's strengthening competitiveness. This is, you mentioned the Green New Deal, a totally shift of priorities, and it has to do with a shift of, let's say, strong currencies in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is facing a world undergoing dramatic change. World trade is slowing, geopolitics is fracturing, and technological change is accelerating. It is a world where long-established business models, and Germany experiences this especially, are being challenged, and where some key economic dependencies are suddenly turning into geopolitical vulnerabilities. Of all the major economies, Europe is the most exposed to these shifts. Europe is the most open. Our trade to GDP ratio exceeds 50%. Compared to the US, it's 27%, and even with China, it's only 37%. Europe is the most dependent. We rely on a handful of suppliers for critical raw materials and import over 80% of our digital technology. The EU has the highest energy prices, and this is a very important part of the Draghi report. EU companies face electricity prices that are 2 to 3 times higher than those in the United States or in China. Europe is severely lagging behind in new technologies. Only 4 of the world's top 50 tech companies are European. And last but not least, we are the least ready to defend ourselves. Only 10 member states spend more or equal the 2% GDP on defense in line with the NATO commitment. The Draghi report lists many policy proposals. I want to mention just one. It is reducing energy prices. And that will be, I know in Germany, but also other European countries, a big political fight. But it must be done. But I'm still optimistic. To modernize Europe successfully, it needs well-working transatlantic relations. We cannot make Europe more competitive when tariffs reduce the access to the most important export market, the US market. We cannot reduce investments in China or trade with China and at the same time increase investments in European security. For a better burden sharing in defense, Europe needs to be economically strong. And therefore, it is in the national interest of the US to support Europe becoming more competitive. And thus, it is in the national interest of the US to have a strong Europe. I'm optimistic also that we have good transatlantic relation with the incoming administration. Thank you. And Masha, I think, Masha, it's you.
Yes, thank you everyone for joining us here today at the Wilson Center, but also to our audience online for what I'm sure will be an excellent discussion on the new European Commission and its priorities. I think both of our speakers made excellent points of what the priorities and the challenges are for the European Union, for Europe, and also for the transatlantic space. And in a year of elections, this is also a year where for the first time, both the US and the EU are changing their leadership at the same time. And as we have seen in the past, this has had meaningful consequences to the relationship, but also more broadly to the global relations. While there's been much analysis done on how the US elections and the new administration is going to impact Europe, we here at Wilson thought that a changing Europe also has an effect on the state of play and the future of transatlantic relations. And this is kind of the focus and the guiding principle of our joint report together with Friedrich Naumann Foundation. The topics are, of course, varied. It goes from security to technology to competitiveness, which only showcases the breadth and depth of the transatlantic relationship. And to start the discussion today, at the launch of our report, I'm delighted to have with me some of our experts that contributed to the report. I'll start with Michelle Egan, professor and Jean Monnet Chair at Personam in the School of International Service at American University, and also a global fellow here at the Wilson Center. Then Dimitris Tsarouchas, I hope I pronounced that correctly, professor of international relations and head of EU projects and partnerships at the Center for EU and Transatlantic Studies at Virginia Tech, and also a global fellow at the Wilson Center. Next, we have Kelly Wicker, who's the director of the Wilson Center Science and Technology Innovation Program, and then Jason Moyer, who's a program associate and a fellow colleague of mine here at the Global Europe Program. So We have a lot to discuss. As you can see, the report has various issues, but I will start first with Michelle, as trade is currently front and center of many discussions due to the looming threat of tariffs. The EU has been rather, as we can say, late to the game when it comes to economic security, but in the recent months, we have seen it taking concrete steps, for instance, imposing tariffs on Chinese EVs. And considering this shift, what do you see will be the top priorities for the Commission when it comes to trade and economic security? And to which of these should maybe US policymakers pay special attention to?
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I think going back to the opening comments would be that this is both a discourse shift to think about international and economic security, but I also think it's a rethinking of the premise of European integration, built on multilateralism, built on open trade, built on the Bretton Woods system. So now we're having to shift sort of a lot of our thinking in Europe towards economic security. And I would say that Europe has been doing this not just with the new guidelines of the upcoming Commission, but I think that they have been doing this for the better part of a decade. And perhaps we in Washington might be thinking about how does that align? And I think that Europe has been shifting towards economic security since around 2018, and it has legislated a lot. And so there's a whole host of pieces of legislation and actions that Europe has done that to some degree do align. It's not just all about EVs. You know, we've had a number of investment screening, anti-coercion instruments, and a whole array of legislative initiatives that I think do resonate here, particularly as Congress has, you know, a committee on China and is very concerned about, unfair trade practices. And so I think there's an alignment there. So do I think that there are things that Washington should be interested in? Yes. And I'll just say 3 bullet points. I think there will be an interest in what Europe and the Commission does in terms of its priorities on trade and economic security and dealing with unfair market practices. The second issue that's not looked at is strengthening the single market to reduce barriers to trade and legislative simplification and dealing with not deregulation, but business simplification. That benefits Americans and Europeans. And I think the third issue is reducing dependencies, addressing vulnerabilities, and diversification of supply chains. How can Europe and the United States work together? So those would be my sort of priorities for the administration or the transatlantic relationship. But I also think we need to think about what Europe has already done.
So you mentioned 2, I think, focus points that are kind of also at the same time a bit conflicting, which is on the one hand, the EU has been focusing a lot more on tackling unfair trade practices, but then at the same time also focusing on reducing dependencies. And as we heard today, we had the agreement with Mercosur for the free trade agreement. And as the EU is trying to navigate all these complex challenges, how do you see its efforts balancing being, in one hand, called the herald of the free trade, but then at the same time strengthening its economic security?
I think trade policy in the EU has gone through a process. In the 1990s, it was all about market access. And there was a lot of criticism of the current administration that they didn't prioritize market access. So the 1990s was about market access and efficiency. 2000 was about transparency and including civil society. Then we moved towards a trade and values, labor rights, deforestation, which is very important in Mercosur. And so now we have on top of that economic security. And here's where I think there'll be a tension within the Commission in terms of portfolios, is there'll be a tension between the economic security and the sort of value-based trade that we also expect from the EU. We tend to focus on the difficult free trade agreements. Think about TTIP, think about CETA, but we tend to also forget that Europe is also very, very flexible. Not everything is a free trade agreement. Sometimes we do digital partnerships, sometimes we do critical minerals agreements. We're agile and flexible in Europe, so we shouldn't see everything as free trade agreements, but we also should remember that despite the difficult ones, and Mercosur being our most recent success, we've also passed a lot of other agreements, EU-Singapore digital, a trade agreement with Japan, one on negotiation with, efforts with India, Australia, and others. So there's a lot. That's something Washington should look at. Are you behind the curve if Europe is actually moving forward with either free trade agreements and flexible partnerships?
These are all great points, especially when it comes to flexibility of agreements. I think that's a really good point to also make to U.S. policymakers. I think switching to Dimitri's, another major concern in Europe, of course, has been Europe lagging behind the United States and China, particularly when it comes to cutting-edge technologies and innovation. We've heard already from the introductory remarks this year we had several significant reports, but the one that we were talking about is the Mario Draghi report on improving competitiveness of Europe that addresses these challenges but also offers a myriad of recommendations. It seems like the European Commission has taken note of this report and the recommendations, and that competitiveness clearly seems to dominate the Commission's to-do list. You dealt with this issue in this report, and what are, in your opinion, some of the key measures the EU will focus on in the next coming years to boost its competitiveness?
Yes, thank you, Masha, and thank you for having me here today. It's great to be here and to discuss this very timely report. Indeed, competitiveness is at the very heart, I think, of what the Commission intends to do. And I want to start by sort of trying to place this a little bit into context to try and understand the urgency behind the Commission's plans to accelerate its transformation through the European Green Deal, which is now going to be combined with an attempt to go back to its roots of seeking to boost productivity. Why do I say this? I'll give you one statistic, which I think is very indicative of where the EU lies today in comparison to its biggest partner, the United States. In 2008, US GDP surpassed the European Union's for the first time. Now consider the difference in population. Today, the United States has a GDP of almost 50% higher than the European Union's. We have had a massive problem in Europe of fundamentally, and that's the fundamental point that the Draghi report makes, of underinvestment. The headline for the Draghi report is that it asks European leadership to enhance investment of 800 billion euros per year over the next decade. Why? Because Europe has fallen so much behind the United States and indeed other regional competitors that unless it gets its act together and starts not only to legislate on particular very vitally important subjects, but also transform the way its economy works, it may fall further behind. So this is almost an existentialist call by the former Italian Prime Minister and head of the European Central Bank. And it comes, of course, Massa, we should also mention that on the back heel of the Letta report, which, going back to Michel's points, is more about the single market. Because this is the other major priority I would identify, and I think the Commission does too, in terms of boosting its competitiveness. The single market of the 1980s and the 1990s was an ideal instrument for its time, and it did extremely well. Nowadays, it doesn't fit the bill anymore. Nowadays, it needs to be massively updated. What we need is a real digital single market, and of course, investing, I'll say the magic word again, investment in new technologies in a way that will allow the EU to fulfill its goals. So how does that look like for the European Commission at this moment? And please do keep in mind that the European Council will play a massively important role here in terms of setting priorities. The Mercosur agreement today, which I think was mentioned and is very welcome, also comes on the backdrop of massive political problems in Europe, and in particular in a member state, namely France, which has been, shall we say, rather skeptical on the Mercosur agreement. So there is a lot of politics here that one needs to keep in mind as we await the new French Prime Minister and the new German government, of course, that should emerge after the election in February. What the European Commission intends to do is introduce the Green Deal Industrial Plan. So what you have here is an attempt, again, it's in the Draghi report, for those of you who are interested, to introduce the notion of a circular economy, which will hit multiple birds with one stone, if I'm allowed the politically incorrect expression. What is going to happen by introducing a circular economy is you're going to allow for sectors of the economy to reindustrialize in a way which is going to be stronger than before. You're going to reduce dependency on foreign adversaries by making sure that you are able to grow endogenously a lot more. And at the same time, of course, allow for the decarbonization of Europe's economy, which is going to give it a long-term structural advantage going forward, and therefore will allow this Commission to become the geopolitical Commission 2.0. Remember when von der Leyen first came in, she talked about geopolitics making a comeback. I think the message from the Green Deal Industrial Plan, from the Industrial Decarbonization Accelerator Act, which is also foreseen by the Commission, is the realization that decarbonization and the introduction of a circular economy will actually be the implementation of a geopolitical commission, reducing foreign dependencies and at the same time boosting alliances with countries like the United States. And I will finish with one more small point on what is still in the menu of the new European Commission. It is the European Critical Raw Materials Act. What we want to make sure here, or what the EU wants to do, is identify a list of critical raw materials such as gallium, lithium, boron, and tungsten, which are crucial for technologies that will allow the EU's main message, green transformation, digital transformation, to go through. There is a lot of legislative initiative, and I invite you all to read our detailed report. I'm not sure all of them will see the light of day, but even if some of them do, that will be structurally significant for the EU going forward.
Thank you. So you've mentioned there is a lot of legislative initiatives tied to boosting competitiveness. And while this focus on competitiveness has been more than welcomed, there's also been a lot of criticism in terms of overlapping portfolios that deal with these issues that could potentially lead to some confusion regarding competencies, but also policy direction when it comes to EU and competitiveness. From your analysis, do you share these concerns, and how do you see, as you've pointed out, there's 6 commissioners, for instance, that are somehow connected to this portfolio. How do you see this affecting EU's capabilities to actually deliver on these reforms?
That's a great question, Marsha. You're right. I mean, if you read the report, my chapter, I do talk about 6 different commissioners, because the themes that that will determine the ability of the European Union to boost its competitiveness are so interlinked, aren't they? If you're talking about a European Green Industrial Deal, you have to deal with industry, you have to deal with competitiveness, you have to deal with the single market, you have to deal with the environment and green resources, you have to deal with digital technology and sovereignty. So there's a lot of overlap. Let me just say that the European Commission over time has become increasingly more focused on the president of the Commission and executive vice presidents delivering most of the work. It used to be a more collegial kind of thing where you got all the commissioners involved. Nowadays, it's more bilateral. So I guess what I'm foreseeing is going to happen is that some of those EVPs, and I think the most important ones here are Teresa Ribera of Spain and Stéphane Séjourné of France, they will have a lot of bilaterals with von der Leyen, with the president, to determine exactly who does what. I should also mention that I'm not too worried about this in the sense that in the mission letters that we studied to prepare this report for you, it is quite clear that certain commissioners, and I identify this in some detail in the report, are tasked with specific aspects of what's going to happen. But I think that there is always the possibility of some politicking coming in. Please don't forget that any new commission that is being set up is always a compromise between different factions within the European Parliament who needs to approve of the commission. And so what I think is going to happen from now on is there's going to be a lot of bilateral give and take. And there's going to be also some division of labor within the commission itself to make sure that we know who does what. But final word on this, Teresa Ribera is considered to be the number 2 behind Ursula von der Leyen. She was sent from Madrid. She has not been uncontroversial because of developments in Spain, but obviously she has the strong backing of Madrid and apparently von der Leyen as well. So it seems to me that her, along with Sejourne, are going to be the ones that will be basically calling the shots on most of the legislative initiatives the Commission will be taking on the European Industrial Green Deal.
Thank you. I think your answer really also sheds light to the role of our report in terms of decoding the European Commission and who's responsible for what for the US policymakers when they want to engage across the Atlantic on particular issues. So thank you for that. So we talked a lot about the need for investment and especially the need for investment in new technologies and of course coming now to you, Kelly. You and Dr. Spurek made an excellent point, I think, in the report about the US and EU, while they're intensely focused on boosting their domestic innovation, that does not necessarily have to come at the expense of the transatlantic partnership. Could you expand a bit more on this? Where do you see opportunities for cooperation between the EU and the US, especially in areas such as technology and innovation? How can we strengthen the cooperation without undermining these individual goals?
Yeah, it's such a great point, and it kind of, I think, links in with some of what we just talked about with potential competition on tech investments and competitiveness. All of these things are so interrelated, and this is kind of the way I live my life at all times. As the director of the tech program, I just kind of stomp into every other program's work, and I'm like, here's what I'm going to do for you. And I think it's going to come down to a lot of questions about the culture on both sides of the transatlantic relationship, especially as we're seeing a pretty major shift in the American government approach to how we view ourselves in the world. But you know, the research ecosystem has always been a global research ecosystem. The graduate schools around the United States, particularly in science and technology, are largely populated by foreign students. And for us to forget the role of foreign talent coming to our shores, bringing new ideas, bringing new concepts, and then taking those back home with them potentially if they were to leave, that's always been a very big part of innovation and development. And the same in Europe. You know, you see a lot of, ETH Zurich is very well known for its developments in science and technology, and we see American students go there as well. To forget the interchange aspect of innovation would be to lose a significant driver of innovation. I also really appreciated, Michelle, you talked about some of the things that are on the table for competitiveness in terms of reducing regulation or simplifying regulation to accelerate entrepreneurship in Europe. You mentioned those are good things for the American companies as well, and I think sometimes we don't talk about that enough. We kind of view this as, well, if they build companies in Europe, they won't build them here, potentially. But our companies are also having to live in that regulatory regime and also maintain the regulatory regimes of 50 different states in this country. And it's in everyone's interest that all of that is a lot easier. And so I guess, but it comes back to that question, though, of on the academic level, we're very practiced at doing projects together, doing grants together, working on topics together, building off of one another's work. Academia is very open, and we see the same thing even in private sector tech development. Many of these things are being developed on open source platforms, even hardware that's open source. This is a big part of scientific research as well as technological. On the political side, there's not always a recognition of that being a key part of how this system works. And so this is one of the things that we talk about a lot in my program, is helping people understand how is science done, how is tech development done, so that that global role can become better understood. But I think that as we kind of grow together into our new phases, we will need to very purposely talk about what are we benefiting from with this exchange of people, ideas, talent, and research.
So you've mentioned, and I think you've mentioned that already in some previous talks that I've listened to, about the different regulation cultures between the European Union and the United States, particularly when it comes to AI. But in your report, you also identify one of the priorities of the new commission will be combating online abuse. And with that, in connection will be the enforcement or the more stricter enforcement of the Digital Services Act and Digital Markets Act. How do you see these efforts affecting transatlantic relations? And we know that there's been a lot of back and forth in terms of the DMN and DSA. And I would just like to hear your opinion on that, because you have pointed out that, for instance, when it comes to AI, there are differences in regulatory approaches. How do you see this affecting future cooperation, also when it comes to regulation and enforcement, which with new technologies coming up, this will be important?
Yeah, and I'm glad you asked that because this is near and dear to my co-author's heart. Sylvia Sporek is a scholar with my program right now and was until very recently a member of the European Parliament, where she championed a lot of these things about protecting young users on the internet, protecting women on the internet, and she's now doing a project here on how cyber violence against women is just a new expression of a very old problem. And so I learned a lot from her part of that report, actually, about how the DSA and the DMA offer tools that have not been leveraged as well as they could to combat abuses online. And so I think both von der Leyen and the two different commissioners that kind of touched this all indicated that they will be actively pursuing DSA enforcement. Sylvia pointed out some things like flaggers. The national service coordinators can designate flaggers who are then tasked with watching for malicious content online to be able to pull it down. I think this is really interesting because this is where we get into this tension between, one of the core tensions between American and EU legislation, which is this question of free speech. As a loud American, I do love free speech. And I think that's one of the things that has really supercharged our ability to drive the internet and to be kind of the genesis of this new culture. But as we are all deeply aware, there are a lot of abuses, and it's affecting us politically and economically and also just personally. And so we're kind of figuring out, what do we do about this? We have a couple of things being proposed here that we haven't passed yet, but we stand to glean a lot of information from how Europe can approach it with a much stronger regime and take those lessons home. I think we also point out on the report that the internet has no boundaries. And so to pretend that, well, European children are fine, but everyone else is kind of on their own, ignores the fact that when a child wants to use something online, a VPN is like a 30-second download away. It is in the interest of Europe to work with the United States and with the corporations to figure out, how do we do this so that it's not easily maneuvered around. And I think it's in the Americans' interest to understand what is working in Europe, because the question we struggle with here, even people who are pro, let's pull some content down, the question is, well, who gets to decide that? Do the companies decide what's allowed to be said online? Does government decide? We're very uncomfortable with all of the answers to those questions. And so if the DSA and the DMA offer some tools that are a more democratic approach to who determines the question of what's available online, I think we could potentially benefit from that legislatively here in this country.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point in terms of that both sides should be interested in what works and on both sides of the Atlantic. I think that's a really good thing to also, or a good thread throughout our report. And another thing, or another overarching theme, of course, I think that goes through all of your contributions is, of course, a multifaceted approach to security. And going from, let's say, soft topic security to more hard security, this leads me then to Jason, who dealt with the topic of European defense. Since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, of course, there's been ongoing calls for Europe to strengthen its role as a security provider. And the new commission seems to be doubling down on these efforts, even appointing a dedicated commissioner for defense and space. What are the specific goals for this new commission to strengthen the defense capabilities? And what do you see as this is something relatively new, let's say? What do you see are some challenges the EU will face to achieve these goals?
Thank you, Masha. Together with my paper co-author, Dr. Ren Marinova, who is another global fellow with the Wilson Center, we unpacked this theme of the defense industry and what are the priorities for the new European Commission. As Masha mentioned, the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 really exposed a lot of the challenges facing the European defense industry. It's highly fragmented. It's heavily underinvested in, and it's very dependent on external providers. So there's now a new European Defense Commissioner. This is the first time that someone has been specifically assigned to this portfolio. If you look at the previous European Commission, the 2019 to 2024 European Commission, they very much were setting the stage through short-term measures, through some longer-term measures, to supercharge Europe's defense industrial base, to improve capacity, to improve their capabilities to provide for Ukraine's defense. All these things take time. So this new European Commission is going to benefit from the actions of the previous Commission and really kind of take some of these short-term measures and make them longer-term. This new European Commissioner for Defense and Space has a number of things on his plate. Within the first 100 days of his mandate, he will issue a new white paper that will go through all of these challenges, that will suggest ways forward. This very much builds on the Draghi report, the Leto report, and of course the Ninisto report, which we haven't mentioned yet, that talks about preparedness and kind of tries to reconceptualize the idea of defense and security to include issues such as environmental incidents, such as the flooding we've seen in parts of Europe as a security threat facing the EU. So this is all, very much a step in the right direction. The overarching goal of the new European Commission is to properly create a European defense union. And what does that mean? That means spending smarter as a bloc, including potentially joint procurement, reducing dependencies on external providers, and just in general filling that R&D gap that's emerged. The EU has really struggled to invest in R&D compared to China, Russia, and even the United States. And that's something that's been identified in some of these reports that have come out in the last 6 months, and something the new European Commission hopes to address.
So yeah, you've mentioned that one of the Commission's priorities for strengthening European defense industry is to buy more European. Thinking about that, how might these efforts affect transatlantic relations, especially given, on the one hand, U.S. calls for Europe to invest more in its own defense, but on the other hand, Europe at the moment buying a lot from European defense companies. But additionally, what implications would a more military capable Europe have for the United States?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm very torn on this. On the one hand, Europe needs a strong defense industry. It needs to invest in its own defense industry because it's buying so much from the United States right now. There's an estimated 100 billion euro loss in efficiency because of this external dependency. So I think in the short run, in the short term, this means that Europe will be buying less from the United States. But in the long run, I think that this will make our European allies more capable partners for the United States. I think it will only lead to a good thing. If you look at the current administration, they've been very much encouraging increased European defense initiatives, increased investment in their defense industry. I do worry, though, that in the long run, this might create some kind of rift in the transatlantic space, in part because of European economies kind of pulling away from the United States in a defense industry capacity. But we'll have to see how that unfolds.
We will see, yes. And so as I've mentioned in the beginning, this year has ushered new leaderships on both sides of the Atlantic. And you all pointed out several priorities in terms of the European Commission or the European Union that will definitely lead to some changes. And considering all of that we've talked about here today, and the implications of these priorities, I would like to do like a quick rapid fire round and ask a simple question. Where do you see the transatlantic relations going from here?
Ow.
We'll
hard.
start. Okay.
No, where do I see it going? That's a tough question. Rapid fire round. Maybe I'll make a wish list. and the wish list will be the inclusion of business. I think we have some frameworks and cooperation between agencies and diplomats, but I feel there isn't a forum or venue to talk about business interests. If we're going to talk about competitiveness, we haven't had anything like the Transatlantic Business Dialogue, and I would encourage more business cooperation, dialogue, and interchange with the administrations on both sides.
Very quickly, it's a very difficult question, Marsha, but I think there is room and ground for optimism on the transatlantic relationship. When I look at the portfolio I examined, the Trade and Technology Council is very new, young, ambitious, and I think both sides of the Atlantic can build on it. At the same time, if I'm allowed very quickly just to an intervention on Jason's remit, I think the biggest thing for Europe here is joint procurement, really. What you need is to enhance efficiencies and make sure that the partnership with the United States will remain rock solid. The biggest problem in Europe is bureaucratic red tape and administrative regulations that hamper genuine innovation. And the moment you actually deal with this, there is so much for Europe to gain from the transatlantic partnership. And lastly, very quickly, this time around, the European Union is more prepared for Trump administration 2.0. And I think there are points of convergence and similarity which will allow them to work together pretty efficiently.
I think on tech, maybe the hardest part will be figuring out who to talk to. I think we kind of referenced this a little bit, like even on the commission, there are a number of commissioners who touch science and technology. And increasingly on the United States side, we're also seeing, the AI and crypto czar, David Sachs, who was just named, will be an advisor and not actually in the government or the cabinet. And so we don't expect to see NIST really have the role that it's played before. And we don't know what OSTP will look like. So where is the center of gravity on tech decision-making going to reside in the United States? And if it is in 14 different places, what is Europe supposed to do about that? And so I think that will be really crucial, is being able to quickly determine who has the pen, and then making sure that person understands how the EU and the US can work together.
So I see another great idea for a new report from our side, but for the EU audience in this particular case. Jason?
Yeah, and on the defense industry side, I think, maintaining support for Ukraine remains paramount for the United States and for the new European Commission. We know the new administration is more focused on the Indo-Pacific and may try to reallocate resources within Europe. So really now is the time for Europe to invest in its defense industry. There's been a lot of talk about the new defense commissioner's interactions with NATO. He's pledged to bolster EU-NATO cooperation and communication. Right now, there's very little communication, especially at the working level, between the EU and NATO. And this is a great way to, in terms of transatlantic relations, to keep the US engaged, is by having a fruitful dialogue between the EU and NATO on shared security matters.
And speaking of fruitful dialogue, I think that's a great segue for me to turn to our audience, who I'm pretty sure has several questions. Yes, here, middle row. We have a microphone, and if you can briefly introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Connor Friend. I'm one of the policy advisors in the House, for a member of the House. I have two questions. One's for Jason, and then there's a section in your paper about EU enlargement, and I have a question on that too. So first on defense, the U.S. obviously has its own issues with our industrial base currently, and procurement obviously not as big as what Europe's facing, but I'm curious, is there any space for joint, instead of pushing away from each other and trying to solve our own industrial bases separately, is there any industry within the defense space where there could be overlap, where there could be cooperation? And then for EU enlargement, in terms of the transatlantic partnership, what kind of role should the next administration play in wrapping up ascension processes for the Western Balkans? I know it's been years for countries like Montenegro, North Macedonia. What role should the United States play as the EU kind of wraps that up?
That's a great question. I think there is a lot of opportunities for cooperation between the United States and Europe when it comes to the defense industry, especially when it comes to R&D. We can see a lot more exchanges in that regard. One of the things that Europe is facing with its defense industry is it's highly fragmented along national lines. And I think the new European Commissioner for Defense is going to try to pull that into more of the EU level, more defense industry matters. And I think that will just make it easier for the United States to interact. And it really comes down to companies at the end of the day. I think we can encourage these companies to work together on projects. We have seen that there are issues with increased demand for HIMARS and other high-quality weapon systems in the U.S., and we are struggling to provide those. So instead, having some European, alternatives. There's been a lot of talk of South Korean alternatives, turning to other parts of the world to provide to fill this shortage that we're currently experiencing. So yeah, there's really just a lot more can be done in this space.
I'll take over the enlargement part since I worked on that report, which is always good as if a moderator can also share their expertise. And you make a good point in terms of EU enlargement really taking a long time, especially for the Western Balkans, and the Western Balkans kind of losing sort of interest in actually joining, especially among the population. And while the United States, of course, cannot play a direct role in moving the enlargement forward, I do think they can play a supportive role as a stabilizing force in the region. I mean, we've seen in the past couple of months or the past couple of years, the stability in the Western Balkans region in particular is very fragile. And while, like I said, no direct role for the enlargement, I think the US has a security presence and can play a security role in terms of supporting the Kosovo-Serbia dialogue that is happening. And I think that it's been in a stalemate since 2013. Or, for instance, looking at the political sharing fractions in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which after 30 years of Dayton, we now have ethnic tensions rising up again. These are all things that resolving these things, helping the EU being a valuable partner in the region, can add to the region and these countries move towards enlargement as well. Oh yeah, here in the front first, and then we'll move to.
So Masha, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit as the author as well, and just ask, and maybe you can take another question as well to take the pressure off. What do you foresee as a change of perspective with a new High Rep for Foreign and Security policy? And maybe that is also linked to the enlargement. Thanks.
Okay. Maybe we can then take another question up there in the middle or there in the back.
Thank you, Jim Mullinex. I'm a diplomatic fellow here at the Wilson Center. Jason, you mentioned China and the new U.S. administration. I think there's a lot of expectation that they will have a foreign policy that places China very high on their list of priorities. I'm sorry that Klaus Loris is not here on the panel, but for those who are here, I'd be very interested to hear your thoughts about how the European Union and the European Commission may approach the challenge of mitigating vulnerabilities to Chinese economic coercion. You talked a little bit about supply chains. Obviously, there's a diversity of views about China within the EU, and so I'd love to hear your thoughts about how the EU might manage that challenge and how it might work with the Trump administration to find ways to do so together. Thank you.
Okay, we can start with this. So I will start with the question on the changes with the new High Representative. I mean, of course, with each change or with each new person that comes into this role, it brings their own experience, their own dynamics, and In terms of Kaja Kallas, of course, she was the Prime Minister of Estonia and a vocal figure in supporting Ukraine's fight against Russian aggression. And I think this will be her primary focus, is to keep this European unity, which we have seen there's been some questions and doubts in terms of support from the European side for Ukraine. I think this will be her primary focus, looking at her past and experience. However, this is just one of the myriad challenges she will be facing. And while I do not doubt her expertise in terms of herself dealing with these, what I think the primary objective of hers will be is to keep unity, because foreign policy in the European Union, as we know, needs consensus, and that takes time. And I think this will be her primary perspective, will be how to keep that unity for the European Union to continue being an important foreign policy actor. Who would like to tackle the China question?
I'll be happy to.
Yeah.
Yeah. So on China, which is of course not very easy, but always happy to take the tough ones. As you said, there is indeed an issue there, because we're not quite sure how the EU is going to position itself. What I've been able to observe is that over time we have had a gradual convergence within the EU institutions towards a position that sees China more as an adversary than an ally on issues such as climate change mitigation policies, where Brussels continues to believe, and rightly so, that it's inevitable that you'll have to work with the administration at some level in order to make progress there. But when it comes to this new Geopolitical Commission 2.0, there are, I think, two issues on which the EU and the US can work together. The first is, and I identified this in the report, the 2023 EU-US Critical Minerals Agreement, which I think is the first step towards identifying ways in which both sides of the Atlantic, the transatlantic partners, will be able to reduce their dependencies on China. And then there is one idea which I think maybe some within the Trump administration may be willing to sort of entertain, and which goes back to the COVID-19 crisis, when the Europeans made a suggestion to the United States for some strategic stockpiling of strategic reserves that we will be able to offload to the market in times of need. Now, I'm not a scientist, well, I'm a social scientist and therefore not a scientist, but I'm not sure when the next COVID-19 crisis will come round, but it's very likely, real scientists tell us. And therefore, maybe there is something there for the United States and the European Union to come together and at least consider the possibility of initiating such an idea, precisely because, as I said at the beginning, China is now increasingly considered an adversary, which wasn't necessarily the case a few years back. So that convergence allows for more cooperation, I think.
Can I chime in too, Masha?
Yes, of
Sorry.
course.
I would add on that what I am really hoping to see a lot more US-EU cooperation on is cybersecurity, particularly in the wake of seeing the Salt Typhoon infiltrations into telecoms networks. If they've been there with this much access, that's not the only place they are. And this is not a question that we can solve individually, because again, cybersecurity, just like the internet, has no national borders. So I'm hopeful that our mutual new governments will really spend a lot of time mitigating those vulnerabilities that will also lead to a stronger kind of democratic regime.
Michelle?
The one area that very few people pay attention to, because it's very technical in Washington, is international standardization. And most standards are written by private companies in collaboration. There's been a number of studies and a general angst that a lot of the international standardization committees and bodies setting a lot of these IT and other standards are actually, China has really put a push through some of its own domestic strategies to chair those meetings. And a lot of angst has come about because traditionally a lot of Europeans did this, and then the United States has not put in as much investment time to support American participation in these international bodies. I'm a little different on that because I think that it's not just about chairing the committees, it's about the international knowledge you bring, the proprietary knowledge, the intellectual property, and other issues. But I see some executive action from the Biden administration to promote the R&D, the international standardization, to deal a lot more with the issue and recognize that this is where European and American firms really need to step up to the plate and shape those global rules and standards, particularly because of concerns about, restriction of the internet. And so it's a whole variety of different areas. And the question becomes, because companies are global and multinational, do you exclude these companies from these conversations, a Huawei or others, or do you include them? So I think international standardization is an area that we need to pay attention to transatlantically.
Here, here.
Okay, we'll couple these three last questions. That will be our last round.
Hello, my name is Ujjwal. The question I have is regarding energy security. In the 80s and 90s, Europe built a lot of nuclear power plants. For example, EDF led the charge and did a lot in terms of ensuring French energy security. So to what extent do you see now with the changed energy environment for there to be perhaps not maybe constructing new plants, but a reopening of the existing nuclear plants across Europe to serve the needs of, de-risking from the volatile energy climate?
We can, there and then in the back.
Hello, I'm Umut. I would like to build on the earlier discussion regarding enlargement. So in the new commission, we see a split between the commissioner for enlargement and the commissioner for the Mediterranean. So I would like to know a little bit more than what I have read in the report, your view, Masha, and the panel. Why do you think there was a need for a split? Can it be interpreted as an impetus for enlargement for those who will fall under the Commissioner for Enlargement and the new broader policy framework for those that will fall under the Mediterranean, how do you see the role of the US when it comes to the Mediterranean in the absence of any enlargement perspective? Will you be only a stability anchor, or will there be more cooperation going forward in terms of the transatlantic relations? Thank you.
And then in the back, yeah.
Mariana Fakhrudinova, I'm a visiting fellow at SIPA from Ukraine. I have a question to Jason. Thanks a lot for outlining the priorities. I think it's a great presentation. But I am very curious in your opinion on how do you think realistic would be to implement those priorities? Because we've seen during this almost 3 years of the Russia's full-scale invasion to Ukraine that member states have been very reluctant to invest more into defense, to even invest more into funds aimed to support Ukraine. So do you think Commission would have some instruments to influence member states to invest more? And time-wise, if we speak about developing European defense industries and becoming less dependent on external providers, as you mentioned, how much time might that take? Are we talking about decades, as some experts outline, or is it years? So what's your perspective on the future, on the implementation of those priorities? Thank you.
Yeah, I can start with that one, and then I'll also touch on the energy question as well. On energy, we had an excellent chapter from a colleague, Dr. Benjamin Schmidt. I would definitely encourage you to take a look at that. I think rather than turning towards nuclear or energy, what we've seen, especially in the Baltics and the Nordics, the countries that have been most impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and having to sever traditional energy ties, we've seen a reduction in usage, and that's actually really helped kind of drive this transition off of Russian energy sources. Finland has been a leader in that regard. Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, they've done a lot in this space. So I think that's one element to look at. But yeah, on this question, Mariana, about how realistic the European Commissioner is, there's been a very mixed response to this idea of a European Commissioner for Defense at the EU level, in part because NATO is the primary platform for all defense and security discussions in the transatlantic space. This is going to take a lot of time. These changes don't happen overnight. It's not flipping a light switch. And frankly, that's not good enough because we have an active war on Europe's doorstep. So yes, these are great long-term steps, and it's very much long overdue, but it's not going to be enough. And Ukraine needs our support now. And in that sense, I think the new European Defense Commissioner can do a lot to encourage member states to invest more. We're seeing that 23 out of 32 NATO states are now hitting their 2% threshold, and many are coming closer to 3%, 4%. And I think that kind of investment, that kind of long-term prognosis for defense industry, for investors to invest in the capacity, in their production capabilities, is very much needed to continue to support Ukraine.
I can touch upon on your question about the enlargement and the Mediterranean being two very specific portfolios. I think this, the creation of these, both of these commissioner positions basically addresses the criticism that the European Commission and more generally the European Union has faced so far, being not paying enough attention to enlargement. And now having to double down because of the enlargement momentum that we have seen since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And on the other hand, the criticism of EU's relations towards the Mediterranean region. In October, we published a report on the future of Euro-MENA relations, which very much amplified how the European Union at the moment is seen as an actor in the region, which is basically having very narrow partnerships in the region focused on solidly tackling migration. And I think creating this position of a commissioner for the Mediterranean, which has really important task of creating a new pact for the Mediterranean and a new strategy, which is long overdue if we look at the Barcelona process, celebrating, I guess, 30 years this year. I think it's very important for the European Union as it deals with all of these questions concerning competitiveness and concerning security to have better and more comprehensive partnerships with the countries in the region. Now, I don't think these countries also pertaining to the rules of enlargement have a future in that perspective. But I do think there can be a lot more of a fruitful cooperation. And I think the European Union is really, at least looking from the priorities of the current Commission, trying to tackle this criticism.
Masha, if I can sort of address the energy question as well, and also maybe say something to Umut's question on the Mediterranean. On energy, in the report, one of the things that I mentioned, and of course it's not me, it's a Draghi report that says, Europe is really suffering from very high energy costs. And so the most important thing, I think, for the new European Commission is to make sure that the new agency that they have created that will allow for the gas and electricity markets to become interoperable and reduce prices is going to be a major priority, because make no mistake, this has huge domestic political repercussions. Hardly any European citizen is happy with the way in which energy policy is actually being reflected on their bill every month. So this is a very practical issue which goes beyond the energy mix that is going to be used. And on the energy mix, because you mentioned nuclear, Germany has had, of course, a very painful experience, right? First with the decision taken by the Merkel administration back in the day, but also, of course, following the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And so I think what Europe as a whole is trying to do is, again, I'll go back to the Draghi report, introduce the notion of a circular economy and make sure, I think there is really no doubt, that there is going to be a period of about 10, 20, maybe more years in which the energy mix is going to have to rely, at least partly, on some more, energy-intensive resources. Now, whether you're going to go nuclear or not, as France did or whatever, I think it's going to be a matter of national priorities where the Commission is not going to get involved. But we are going to need a diversified energy mix. And very quickly on Umut's question, if I may, on the Mediterranean. I think the worry here is that certain countries which are part of the enlargement portfolio are going to fall under the Mediterranean portfolio. And Masha knows this because she was a fellow on the EU-Turkey Forum. And I'm thinking of Turkey, of course, here. I think the worry in Turkey is you may end up being considered not even a candidate country anymore and be completely sort of sidelined from the enlargement negotiations. Now, we all know they're technically frozen and for very good reasons, but the point is, do you want to keep the momentum going, or do you want to give the impression that Turkey is going to be completely excluded from the next potential round of some kind of accession talks? And that's where I think, Masha, the Trump administration can play a very meaningful role. The United States has always excelled, I think, in making sure that relations between Europe and Turkey in particular move forward. And that is going to be an opportunity for Europe too. And having said that, the meeting by the new High Representative Kaja Kallas with the Turkish Foreign Minister the other day was also partly about creating a new music in the room, about a positive momentum in that relationship.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. I think I can say that the overarching theme from what we discussed today is the need for continued transatlantic dialogue and the importance of the transatlantic relationship. And I would like to thank all of our speakers for their excellent contributions and for joining us today. Thank you all for your excellent questions. And the report will be online on our website after this event. So I hope you'll be able to get a chance to read it more in depth. Thank you.
Thank you.